The Afghanistan War has been a complex conflict spanning several decades, involving multiple factions and international players. The origins of the war trace back to the Cold War era, and the repercussions have been felt globally. This essay delves into the key events, dates, and figures involved in the Afghanistan War, providing a detailed analysis of the major milestones. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. On December 24, 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan, marking the beginning of a 10-year conflict that would embroil the region in violence. This invasion was a result of growing tensions within Afghanistan's government and the rising power of communist factions. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, sought to support the Afghan communist government, led by President Babrak Karmal, who had taken power following the assassination of Hafizullah Amin. The Soviets believed that their intervention would stabilize the region and prevent the spread of Islamic insurgencies. However, they underestimated the resolve of the Afghan people and the growing international opposition. The United States, along with several other nations, quickly condemned the Soviet invasion. Under President James Earl Carter, the U.S. began providing covert aid to Afghan resistance groups, known as the Mujahideen. This assistance included financial support, weapons, and training. The CIA, through Operation Cyclone, played a crucial role in funding the Mujahideen, eventually funneling billions of dollars into the conflict. The war in Afghanistan became a proxy battlefield for the Cold War, with the Soviets on one side and the U.S. and its allies on the other. The Mujahideen Resistance, 1980s. Throughout the 1980s, the Mujahideen, a loose coalition of Afghan resistance fighters, fought against the Soviet forces. The Mujahideen, backed by the US, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other nations, used guerrilla tactics to wear down the Soviet military. The terrain of Afghanistan, with its rugged mountains and remote valleys, provided the Mujahideen with natural defenses. The war was characterized by brutal fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union began to experience significant setbacks in Afghanistan. The cost of the war, both in terms of finances and human lives, became too much to bear. Soviet forces, numbering over 100,000 at their peak, were unable to maintain control over the country. The Afghan people, largely opposed to foreign occupation, continued to resist fiercely. By 1986, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev publicly acknowledged the need to find a way out of the conflict. The Geneva Accords, 1988. On April 14, 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed, marking the beginning of the end of the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. The agreement, brokered by the United Nations, involved the withdrawal of Soviet troops and the cessation of U.S. aid to the Mujahideen. Over the next year, Soviet forces gradually pulled out of Afghanistan, with the final troops leaving on February 15, 1989. The Soviet Union had lost over 15,000 soldiers, while millions of Afghans had been killed or displaced. Despite the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan remained in turmoil. The Mujahideen, having driven out the Soviets, turned their attention to the Afghan government, which was still in power under President Mohammad Najibullah. The Afghan Civil War, which had begun in the late 1970s, continued as various factions vied for control. The power vacuum left by the Soviets allowed extremist groups to gain a foothold in the country, setting the stage for the rise of the Taliban. The rise of the Taliban, 1990s. In the early 1990s, Afghanistan descended further into chaos. The Mujahideen factions, no longer united against a common enemy, began fighting among themselves. Kabul, the capital city, was devastated by rocket attacks and street battles. In this environment of lawlessness and instability, a new force emerged, the Taliban. The Taliban, a militant Islamic group, was formed in the early 1990s by former Mujahideen fighters and students from Islamic religious schools, known as madrasas, in Pakistan. Led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban quickly gained support from Afghans who were disillusioned with the ongoing violence and corruption. The group's promise to restore order and impose strict Islamic law appealed to many. By 1996, the Taliban had taken control of Kabul and established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban's rule was characterized by harsh interpretations of Sharia law, including restrictions on women's rights, the banning of music and television, and public executions. The Taliban also provided safe haven to extremist groups, including Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, 2001. The events of September 11, 2001, when Al-Qaeda terrorists attacked the United States, dramatically shifted the global focus back to Afghanistan. In the aftermath of the attacks, U.S. President George Walker Bush demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the attacks. When the Taliban refused, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001, with the goal of toppling the Taliban regime and dismantling al-Qaeda. The U.S.-led coalition, which included NATO forces, quickly succeeded in overthrowing the Taliban government. By December 2001, the Taliban had been driven from power, and a new interim government was established under President Hamid Karzai. However, while the Taliban's regime was dismantled, the group itself was not eradicated. Many Taliban fighters fled to Pakistan, where they regrouped and launched an insurgency against the Afghan government and coalition forces. The Taliban insurgency, 2002 to 2021. For the next 2 decades, Afghanistan remained embroiled in conflict. The Taliban insurgency gained strength, particularly in rural areas, where the Afghan government had little control. Despite the presence of over 100,000 U.S. and NATO troops at the height of the conflict, the Taliban continued to carry out attacks, using guerrilla tactics similar to those employed by the Mujahideen against the Soviets. In addition to the Taliban, other extremist groups, including the Haqqani Network and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, also operated in Afghanistan. The Afghan government, plagued by corruption and inefficiency, struggled to maintain stability. International efforts to rebuild Afghanistan, including billions of dollars in aid, often failed to produce lasting results. By the mid-2010s, the U.S. and its allies began to reassess their involvement in Afghanistan. In 2014, NATO officially ended its combat mission in the country, transitioning to a training and advisory role. However, U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan, and the Taliban continued to make gains. The Doha Agreement and U.S. Withdrawal, 2021. In February 2020, the U.S. and the Taliban signed the Doha Agreement, which outlined a framework for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. The agreement, negotiated by the administration of U.S. President Donald John Trump, called for the withdrawal of all U.S. forces within 14 months in exchange for security guarantees from the Taliban. However, the Afghan government was not directly involved in the negotiations, and the Taliban continued to launch attacks against Afghan forces. In April 2021, U.S. President Joseph Robinette Biden announced that the remaining U.S. troops would be withdrawn from Afghanistan by September 11, 2021, marking the 20th anniversary of the September 11 attacks. The decision was met with both support and criticism, as many feared that the Afghan government would collapse without U.S. military support. Indeed, as U.S. troops began to withdraw, the Taliban launched a major offensive, rapidly capturing territory across Afghanistan. By August 15, 2021, the Taliban had entered Kabul, and President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The speed of the Taliban's takeover shocked the international community, and scenes of chaos at Kabul's airport, where thousands of Afghans sought to flee, dominated global news. The aftermath, the return of the Taliban. With the Taliban back in power, Afghanistan once again faces an uncertain future. The international community has grappled with how to respond to the new Taliban government, particularly in terms of recognizing its legitimacy and providing humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. The Taliban has promised a more moderate rule compared to its previous regime in the 1990s, but reports of human rights abuses, particularly against women and minorities, have raised concerns. The war in Afghanistan has left deep scars on the country. Millions of Afghans have been displaced, and countless lives have been lost. The infrastructure of the country remains in ruins, and the economy is in shambles. While the U.S. war in Afghanistan has officially ended, the long-term impact of the conflict will continue to shape the region for years to come. The Afghanistan War, from the Soviet invasion in 1979 to the U.S. withdrawal in 2021, has been one of the most prolonged and devastating conflicts in modern history. It has involved multiple international powers, including the Soviet Union, the United States, and NATO, and has had far-reaching consequences for global security. As Afghanistan enters a new chapter under Taliban rule, the lessons of the past 40 years remain critical for understanding the challenges that lie ahead.